a medical devices company that develops and supplies clinical diagnostics to the pathology market. It is also a research, instrument, and medical device company, as well as a division of Danaher Corporation. Elliott O. Glasser, my apologies, is the HR director for Leica Biosystems. He leads the human resources strategies, programs, and tools to drive a high-performing, engaged workforce. Ken Thompson is CEO and principal partner of AlignOrg Solutions and is an industry-leading expert in strategy, organization design, and alignment, operational efficiency, accountability-driven leadership, and change management. Ken works with executive teams to help them win in the competitive marketplace. AlignOrg Solutions is the founder of the Conference Board's Organization Design Conference and a lead sponsor of our 2023 conference. Please welcome Ken and Elliott.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. So because we're running behind schedule, we'll get right started.
Yeah, let's do it.
Anatomical pathology, maybe we should define that term before we get started. Who in the room knows what that means? Okay. Well, May is Skin Cancer Awareness and Melanoma Awareness Month, so it's a good time to define what anatomical pathology is. So if you go to your dermatologist and you see a spot that you might think it's melanoma or might be malignant, and then take a biopsy of that tissue, they send it away to a lab, and then you find out whether or not that's cancerous, right? So anatomical pathology is that whole process. What Leica Biosystems does is we design, manufacture, and market everything in that workflow. So from the tissue collector to the slides that the tissue gets applied to the dyes that are applied to that tissue, to the microscopes that take pictures of that tissue. Everything that we do is tied to that workflow in terms of improving the time between biopsy and diagnosis. So that's what we do, and that's what anatomical pathology is. Leica Biosystems is a division of Danaher Corporation. I will get into what Danaher is and what we do in a couple minutes. I will hand it over to Ken to introduce himself.
All right. It's a pleasure to be here. I know we're, I think, the last or one of the last speakers, so thank you for your commitment to this conference and for supporting us here. We're excited to share a few lessons learned. This is all about Leica, their lessons learned, their transformation, and some of the tools and processes that we use to help deliver that success that we want to share with you today. So if you'll hit the next slide, Elliott. This is just a quick background about AlignOrg. We've been around for almost 30 years. We specialize in organization transformations. We love to play in the complex Fortune 500 space. And these are just a few of the logos we've had the opportunity to have some learnings with. Next slide. We shared this yesterday. I think Rebecca had this up on the stage. This is the roadmap that we typically use when we go through an organization transformation. We ask, what does it look like? So there's always a diagnosis element, and you can go ahead and build it out. I think there we go. Thank you. We have a diagnosis element where we make sure that we understand the current environment, how we're, what's happening with the competitors, what initiatives do we want to solve, what results are we looking to get. Then we have steps 2 and 3, which is more the design process. This is how we're going to win over the competitors, or how are we going to manage a merger and acquisition so that 1 + 1 is actually 3, and those types of things. Once we have the design work done, then it goes into the implementation stuff. So there's the change management piece, the realization, sustainability, building out those project charters, milestones, triggers, all of those typical things. One thing that I think is key to this presentation, if you look there across the top, there's this purple bar that says alignment leadership. This is something that we're a very big proponent of, is what is the leader's role? What is the HR leader's role, the HR VP's role in a transformation as they support the business partner? And of the many transformations that we've done in the last year or two, we look at Elliott with Danaher as being one of the best that we've seen in this role. And that's why I asked if we could share the stage with him, because we feel that he managed this role brilliantly. And it was not an easy transformation. A lot of significant stakeholders to manage at the corporate level, at the opco level, at the platform level. And he did this very, very well. So this is the purpose of our presentation today, is how do you have the success that Elliott did in that type of role? Next slide. Okay, I think it's
great. Thanks. So Ken used a couple terms opco, platform, corporate. And it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit more about what Danaher Corporation is and what they do. So it's a Fortune 150 company, over 30 billion in revenue last year. Market cap was at about 160 when I checked this morning. It's a super acquisitive company. We buy and improve companies in a couple key areas. So diagnostics, life sciences, and biotechnology are key areas of focus. Our environmental and applied solutions down at the bottom there is going to be divested into its own publicly traded company called Veralto later this year. What's been key to Danaher's success is the ability to identify good acquisition targets and then operationally improve them through what we call the Danaher Business System. It's a suite of proprietary tools that we use to run all of our businesses. It has its origins in lean manufacturing techniques from Japan. So it's based off of Toyota production system, but at this point it has a couple other key verticals in terms of growth, in terms of innovation, and then also commercial growth, as well as our leadership pillar. You probably haven't heard of any of the companies that are on this slide. It's mostly business to business. So we're supplying science and technology leaders. Maybe the one company, I don't know if it's on this slide, that you might have heard of is Pantone, down at the very bottom right of the slide. So Pantone, the color company that everyone knows, is probably our most consumer-focused product, but super business to business. We focus on acquiring companies, integrating them into our portfolio, improving them through our proprietary system of the Danaher Business System. Leica might be a name that you've heard. Okay, so maybe you might have heard of a Leica camera. So Leica Biosystems is actually a descendant of Leica camera. So this slide kind of illustrates where we're at right now. Leica Microsystems and Leica Biosystems are both part of Danaher Corporation. Leica camera, the consumer business, is not part of Danaher. And then there's also Leica Geosystems, which quite frankly, I don't know what they do. It's something about GPS and spatial awareness, but it's also not part of our organization. This slide talks about the history of Leica Biosystems. Probably the most important parts for this presentation are year 2005 and 2012. So when Danaher acquired Leica in 2005, it was Leica Microsystems, a standalone company. Leica Biosystems was a subsidiary of Leica Microsystems. And then in 2012, because of market dynamics, Leica Biosystems became its own its own standalone operating company underneath Danaher. I probably should have mentioned one of the organizing principles to Danaher, the way that we set up our businesses, is this idea of customer centricity. So unlike a lot of big conglomerates that might buy a company, fully integrate them, we keep all of the decision-making power for our operating companies down with the business. We really believe that having your leadership team focused on the individual customer, the individual go-to-market strategy is really paramount to our success. So because Leica Microsystems focuses on high-powered microscopes and we focus on anatomical pathology, those two parts of Leica were split out and became their own separate businesses. What that meant was that each operating company had its own leadership team. So its own operating company president, its own HR leader, its own IT leader, and so on and so on and so on. But there was a decision made to bring the IT organizations back together. One of the tools in the Danaher Business System is the concept of dynamic resource allocation, or DRA, which means that your decisions about how you allocate resources are never static, they're always dynamic. You should always be reevaluating how you optimize your resources based off of your set of current business priorities. So we made the decision to bring the two organizations together, but after a decade of being apart, there were some issues that we had to work through from an organizational standpoint. So one of the major issues was SAP. So when the two operating companies were separated, we maintained one SAP instance for both Leica Biosystems and Leica Microsystems. It was managed by Leica Microsystems. They're sort of a lower growth, steady state business, not focused on incremental investment. Leica Biosystems growing at a much faster rate, focused on making the appropriate investment to sort of charge the future of the organization. And so when we made the decision to bring the IT teams together, it was done under the Leica Biosystems operating company. And AlignOrg was selected as the key partner to help manage the build out of that new one Leica IT organization. We also had a new CIO. So we had someone who had never gone through this sort of transformation before, and they were bringing together IT teams from both of the operating companies. Desired outcomes, really getting our current IT leaders, so the direct reports to the two CIOs that were working for Leica Biosystems and Leica Microsystems, to be on the same page for a future state organization under this new leader. And we wanted to make sure that we were using data to inform our decisions, and we needed to get a change and implementation roadmap done so that we could execute this change within 4 months.
All right, so great setting the stage. So as you can imagine, what Elliott was just talking about is we have these two pretty significant IT infrastructures, two IT organizations from relatively two separate companies that shared the first part of their name. And what we want to do is bring them into one. So how do you do this? How do you get, so it's not just adding everybody together and inherently getting those inefficiencies that might bring. How do we truly gain efficiencies? How do we drive effectiveness in the right areas by bringing two organizations into one? And so this is our approach that we took. We started over here on the right and we said, hey, what are the results that we're trying to get? What does a winning IT organization that can support both parts of the organization as they merge into one, how does that happen? How would we know we're winning? How would that be manifest in our business? And then we go over to where we are today on the left side of the slide where it says environment. What are the factors? What are the different ERPs that are managed in both systems? What are the people? What are the people's skills? What work do they do? Where do they do it? Where do they control it and resource it? And the bridge between where we are today to this outcome of a complete IT section is solved by using these 3 steps here in the middle. 1, what is the strategy? What is the purpose? So in essence, why does Danaher want a consolidated IT system? What business value do they have to deliver to the business leaders? And what should their superpowers be for Leica IT? And then what capabilities do they need to exploit in order to do that? And so it's probably not all capabilities that both independent organizations are doing today. We actually had to hone that in and say, what do we need to be really, really good at? What services do we still need to provide internally to our internal customers as well as externally? And then we spent time with Elliott and the teams and these leaders of 2 IT organizations coming together and working around the 6 sides of the cube. You've probably seen our cube out there, but this is just a fancy way of saying, hey, there are multiple systems of an organization that need to come together in alignment amongst themselves to enable the strategy. So we had to look at all the work that was being done. We had to look at all the processes that spanned across the organization. We had to look at the metrics, the culture, the decision rights, and merge all of that so that we can truly deliver and enable those critical capabilities to deliver the IT strategy. And so this is in essence the journey that we went on. Now, specifically, what did that journey look like? This is what it looked like. This is an excellent roadmap. You may want to take a picture. This is kind of what it felt like to be in the room for a few days with Elliott and his team. And this is a big part of what I think he managed very, very well that he'll talk about here in a minute. But I'm not going to cover every step. But in essence, we had to talk and articulate the strategy. Who are key stakeholders and what needs do they have and how do we satisfy their needs? What is our value proposition as an IT organization? What are we willing to give up in order to deliver on that significant value proposition, and what are those capabilities? So that's the strategy clarification piece. Then we started to look at the work. Imagine work being done in all these different places across 2 organizations. Now we're coming into one. Well, what work do we still need to do? What work do we still want to do? Where should that happen? What should we merge? What is excess, et cetera? This was not like a cost down exercise. It was really an efficiency and effectiveness play. And so we had to look at it specifically through the work lens to say, okay, what work truly enables our strategy and how do we want to control and resource that? And what work needs to be driven for efficiency? If you go to the next slide. Then we looked at structure implications. So before we just started immediately saying, okay, who has a job, who doesn't, who sits in what box, what roles and titles, we spent some time on the organizing rationale. We said, how do we support a global company and what needs to sit where? Do we organize by geography? If so, where? Do we organize by product? If so, where? Do we organize by our customers, our internal customers? If so, where in our organization? Ultimately, that turned into a structure solution. Once we have that, then we had discussions around decision rights, around linkages, and then we pivoted into the metrics and what roles have changed and to what degree. At the end of the day, we then had a complete framework solution developed collaboratively by all the key leaders of the IT organization and a few other experts such as Elliott, where we now had this blueprint for success. We haven't implemented anything yet. It was just the design. But one of the things that was magic about it, it was co-created. We took them on a journey. They made tough trade-off choices, but they did it together. Didn't always agree, but they came to agreement. And as we walked out of the room, they were all very energetic about supporting the solution. Elliott.
Yeah. Getting everyone in the room was a big part of that. And I should say, so I manage a team of HR business partners around the globe. And I think the ratio in that room of HR to IT leader was like one HR person for every 3 IT leaders. It was a lot of heavy HR involvement that ended up getting us where we.
And you can imagine, I mean, there's 2 organizations knowing they're going to be one. We needed this extra footprint in this case because there was a lot of anxiety on what role am I going to have? If my counterpart is also doing a similar role for this other company, are we going to have 2 of us? Or is it going to be one of us? If it's only one of us, then what happens to me?
Yep. It was interesting when we made the decision to bring the 2 IT organizations together. So IT typically in an organization reports into finance, and typically CFOs don't know a lot about org design or about IT capability. They're really concerned about like controlling costs, and that's about it. So having HR as a strategic partner to come in and really advise the new CIO in the absence of CFO knowledge really ended up being a great add as well. So I'm not going to go through every single part of what Ken just walked through in terms of process, but I'll start at the beginning. So stakeholder feedback was really sort of a North Star that we had to establish before we all got in the room and started talking about org structure. As you can imagine, as Ken said, when leaders are coming together, a lot of people in the room had duplicative roles. So you're getting into the room, you're saying, okay, there's only going to be one end user support leader at the end of the day. Who's it going to be? And a lot of times thinking about who is it going to be will inform how you show up in that meeting, how you're presenting your ideas, which was not what we wanted to have happen. So getting the stakeholder feedback from both sides of the LBS and LMS organizations to really understand what was the problem that we were trying to solve with this new organization was really important. So really IT was seen as transactional and sort of not great at even the transactional pieces. There were significant concerns about talent and staffing from both sides. This is a global organization. We have manufacturing, R&D, and distribution globally. And so making sure that we had a staffing model that supported sort of around the globe as the sun goes. Support was really, really important to the business. And there were concerns about how the IT needs from the 2 businesses were going to be met. So as I said, they're completely different businesses that they share the first name, different go-to-market strategies. They have different needs in terms of Salesforce and SAP. And so making sure that we were both able to harmonize and synergize where it was important, but also create that differentiation for the 2 different businesses was one of the important things. So this was an operating model that we designed, I think on day 1 or day 2 of our meeting. And really this, I'm not going to go through all of it, but as we think about going back out to the organization and socializing this transformation with 2 sets of leadership teams, 2 CFOs, 2 operating company presidents, as well as leadership from Danaher. The Danaher CIO was heavily involved in the change as well. making sure that all that stakeholder management was done. This served as a great way to visually represent what was going on. Both Leica Biosystems and Leica Microsystems, it's a German company in heritage, though it's global at this point. We still have a heavy presence in Germany, and there's a lot of negotiation. If anyone's worked with German works councils, it's a lot. So having collateral to go back and discuss the change with the works council, because we had not one but 3 works councils in Germany to manage this change through, also served as a really important piece of presentation material to help them understand why the change was occurring, not just what boxes were moving on the org chart, but why the change was occurring.
I'd like to say just one quick question on that last. It's not about the details of the operating model that are important, I think, for today's conversation. It is important about having the conversation about how is value delivered across all the key stakeholders of your organization. How do those interactions happen? Who does what where? How is all this going to come together to tell the story? I know there's a lot of change practitioners in the room. Many times having a visual depiction of how value is delivered in the part of your organization that you're working in can really help with that change management process because you can tell the story. It kind of bridges the gap between the strategy piece all the way over to the roadmap and org structure that often people see that say, well, org structure is org design. It's not. There's all these other steps that happen in the middle. And I think this is a very excellent activity in many cases just to help visualize all of these key interactions. We probably spent almost a day developing it. It's not the fanciest, sexiest thing you've ever seen, but it tells our story. And it allows great conversations to happen at all different aspects of the organization that are impacted by these choices. So just something to consider as you do your work.
Yeah. So here's the future state org chart that we came up with through the process of this design work. Probably not revolutionary in terms of an IT operating model and org design. But I think what's important to highlight are the green and blue bubbles. So sort of read new role as new responsibility. This exercise was all done in a headcount neutral environment. So there was no appetite for increasing headcount. We were not going to be going out and hiring people. This was use what you have, build something new that delivers new capability to the organization. So really a fundamentally different organization than we had going into this process, but one that was collaboratively arrived at through all the IT leaders that now hold these positions. So how it worked and lessons learned. So we're going to open up for questions, but just high level in terms of what I'd mentioned through the course of this talk, heavy HR alignment was super critical across all parts of the org. So not just for the transactional pieces of like getting people moved into different roles, but as I said, sitting in the room, understanding not just what was going to happen, but why it was happening, and being able to coach our leaders, our IT leaders, through that change was super critical. Because of the sort of underlying tension that existed between the two IT organizations, having AlignOrg come in and be an objectives or third-party facilitator, I think really gave people peace of mind that political agendas from either side of the organization weren't being introduced, right? We had sort of a referee in the room, so to speak, to help us think through in a linear and rational way what org made the most sense, which for IT people was a great way to go about it. They understood sort of the linear process, being super clear and aligned from that customer feedback on what the problem is that we're trying to solve, and making sure that the group understood that this wasn't a 1 + 1 = 2 exercise. This was a net new organization. It was not just bringing people together under their existing sort of IT subfunctional stacks, and then really trusting the process. So the process that Ken walked through is super detailed and elaborate. When you're locked in a room for a week, people can go through that change curve at different rates, and sometimes become resistant to what's going on. And being able to quickly go through that change curve, get back on track, and trust the process was super critical. Though I do think there was one day we were locked in the room for like 12 hours, and that was we're like not leaving until we made some critical decisions.
I'd love to dovetail into just a quick comment. I think this is where the value of this symbiotic relationship between a facilitator, whether it's an external or internal facilitator, I'm not sure matters as much, and the HRBP role or an HR leader role, and the business partner and their teams. Because the facilitator can show up with the process, as you mentioned, take them through that objective way of looking at, they can poke at things and really make sure that the theories and ideas are tested and true. They can also bring in outside examples to maybe help them think of things a little bit differently. But as Elliott said, there's a lot of change happening right there in the room, and especially in a dynamic like this, where these two organizations are kind of merging into one, and not everybody's going to have the same role as they had beforehand. And so I saw Elliott and his team constantly pulling people off to the side and having some crucial conversations with them. There were times when a couple leaders would start to get a little bit emotional, and it would start to get a little bit hard on the design, and his team took care of that for us. And they would come back in, they'd be reset and focus back in on the ultimate outcome of what's best for the business. Having that role was critical for our success, and I'd like to believe that our model and our way of bringing an outside look was critical for their success. And that's how I think an ideal transformation should work, each of us owning these different parts of the roles. And frankly, Elliott has done this about as good as any client I've seen in a long time, because he had a corporate perspective of all the needs and desires and expectations of Danaher corporate, in addition to the two business leaders. And he had representatives in the room taking care of those interests, as well as coaching the leaders on how to show up and how to manage this change.
Thanks. I won't go through challenges because I hit all of them, but that's in summary, and we're running out of time, so I want to open it up to questions. Sure.
We're going through something similar right now. Did you train or do any education with your HR managers or the leadership team before going in the room?
Yes. So I've been with Danaher for 6 years. I've been in 4 different roles while I've been with them, and I've used AlignOrg methodology since like my first job. So I was super familiar with AlignOrg's process and walked through with the HR team from Leica Biosystems, as well as my team who was going to be in the room, kind of high level what the process was, what to expect. So they were familiar with what we were going to be doing. But since we had an outside facilitator, it wasn't as important for them to be familiar with the process. The value that I felt like they brought was knowing the leaders, having established relationships with the leaders that were going through that change curve, and being able to issue, spot, coach, and guide those leaders through the process. But the facilitation was done by AlignOrg, so it wasn't intimate knowledge of the process wasn't super important.
Could you tell us a story, a juicy, challenging story of drama in the room when you knew that there were two people who wanted the same thing, but they were feeling kind of awkward and maybe they said things that were awkward? How did you navigate through that?
I could tell you a story, yeah.
We had some.
We definitely had some. The new CIO was really the one that should have been doing that coaching, right? They're in the room trying to establish their leadership team to move into the future. So I would say the more people the person that I pulled out of the room the most to have a discussion was our new CIO, to say, hey, this is a coaching opportunity for you to establish a relationship with your new team and help them go through that. But I wasn't playing mediator in that sense. It was more of a, hey, let's kind of reground in the process. We all agreed that we were taking a fresh look at the organization, and we kind of have to go into it with this blue sky mentality. So I wish I had a juicier story that I could tell, but.
I would just add to that, I think one of the most difficult things for the business leader taking his or her team through the transformation that we get asked all the time, how do I show up? What role should I play in this? Am I dominant? Do I lead out? Do I make decisions? Or do I sit back and let the team do it? When do I interfere and when do I not? And every transformation is slightly different. But there again, this is the role of the HR leader, is to help them with that dynamic, because they can also be reading the team. Because, really as you're going through design choices, you want that to be somewhat collaborative, but you still want to move it forward. But there are times when it gets stuck and a decision does need to be made. And so most leaders are very conscientious of this and want a little bit of coaching. Hey, now is now the time I say, okay, I've heard both sides. This is what I recommend, and let's move forward with this framework, and we'll continue to build. And that's when Elliott and his team would step in with this, because it was a new leader. And he's trying to kind of establish himself, but didn't want to be over dominant. And I thought he helped that leader step in and fulfill that role, and earned a ton of credibility and respect with his team, because it was the right blend of leadership, decision-making, and collaboration.
Do we have time for one more question?
One more.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Shraddha. You mentioned that you wanted to do this exercise as headcount neutral when you brought the two organizations together, but you wanted to build new capabilities. So how did you ensure that the old people had the new skills, and what did you do in ensuring that they sit in the right places?
We're still working on that, right? Yeah, we're still working on that. And while I would say while we're remaining headcount neutral, we're not necessarily remaining with the same team members. So we also have gotten into subsequent discussions around, hey, if we're really going to invest and make the right decisions around the future of this IT organization, sometimes you're not able to retain all the people that you have. Sometimes you do have to make some tough decisions around some restructuring.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.